This is Ethan, a once famous artist who vanished after losing everything, now living in the shadows of New York City. And this is Lila, a billionaire's daughter who spent $10,000 on his abandoned painting, without knowing the artist was homeless. What happens when their worlds collide? Will they create something extraordinary, or will it all fall apart again? I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. The chandelier above sparkled with the intensity of 100 diamonds, each shard of light bouncing off the polished marble floors of the Montgomery Art Center. Lila Montgomery sat at the long mahogany table, surrounded by Manhattan's elite, sipping champagne that tasted more like duty than delight. "You should bid on something impressive," her father, Edward Montgomery, whispered beside her. His sharp gray suit blended seamlessly with the room's polished grandeur. "It's about making a statement, Lila. These events are not about what you like. They're about being seen." Lila offered a faint smile, the kind she had perfected over years of playing the dutiful daughter. She glanced at the lineup of art pieces displayed around the room, each one sterile in its perfection, crafted for value rather than vision. She felt like a bird in a gilded cage, longing for something to stir her restless heart. "Next up," the auctioneer announced, his voice cutting through the polite hum of the crowd, "we have an anonymous donation, starting at $5,000. Lila's attention snapped to the stage. Amid the gilded frames and polished canvases stood a painting unlike any other. It was small, unassuming, and entirely haunting. A stormy night sky consumed most of the canvas, while a flicker of golden light spilled from a lone, shattered street lamp. It was raw, imperfect, and pulsing with emotion. "Anonymous?" Edward scoffed under his breath. "It's probably from an amateur. Stick to something with provenance, Lila." But something about the painting called to her. The chaotic brushstrokes seemed to echo the restlessness she felt in her own life. The flicker of light, a fragile hope against overwhelming darkness. Without thinking, her hand shot up. "5,000, she declared, her voice clear and unwavering. Edward's head snapped toward her. "Lila, what are you doing?" "7,000, a voice countered from across the room. "10,000, Lila said, louder this time. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers darting like fireflies. Edward leaned closer, his voice a sharp hiss. "This is absurd. That painting has no value." "It has value to me," she replied, her eyes never leaving the stage. The auctioneer, visibly delighted by the unexpected bidding war, raised his gavel. 10,000. Going once, going twice. Sold to the young lady in the front." The gavel struck, sealing her impulsive decision. Edward's jaw tightened as Lila rose to claim her prize. "You've just made a spectacle of yourself for no reason," he muttered. "Maybe I wanted to be seen," she shot back, surprising even herself. As she approached the painting, the chaos of the room seemed to fade. Up close, the work was even more compelling. The stormy clouds loomed like ghosts, and the broken street lamp cast a light that felt more defiant than fragile. She turned to the auctioneer. "Who created this?" He shrugged apologetically. "It was left anonymously at the charity office. No name, no details, just the painting." Her fingers traced the edge of the frame, her pulse quickening. On the back of the canvas, scrawled in hurried handwriting, were the words, "To the streets that hold my soul." Lila felt a shiver run through her. "Miss Montgomery," a curator called, snapping her out of her trance. She nodded, signaling them to prepare the piece for delivery. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the painting's raw energy lingered with her, stirring something she couldn't quite name. She knew it was reckless to spend $10,000 on a piece with no name, no history, and no clear value. But deep down, Lila also knew this was the first thing in a long time that had made her feel truly alive. The painting hung on Lila's penthouse wall, its presence a silent rebellion against the pristine perfection of the room. Every time she walked past it, the broken street lamp seemed to cast its faint golden glow into the cold, polished space. It was almost unnerving, how something so chaotic could feel so alive. Her friends didn't understand. "You're telling me you dropped 10 grand on that?" Daphne exclaimed over brunch, pushing her oversized sunglasses up her perfectly sculpted nose. "It's a statement," Lila replied, swirling her mimosa. "It's a stormy street corner," Daphne shot back. "Honestly, it's giving haunted energy. Are you sure it's not cursed?" Lila laughed it off, but she couldn't deny the way the painting lingered in her thoughts, pulling at her curiosity. Who had created it, and why had they chosen to remain anonymous? The next morning, she decided to find out. She started with the charity office where the painting had been donated. The receptionist, a harried woman in her 50s, offered a polite but unhelpful smile. "I'm sorry, Miss Montgomery. We don't keep detailed records for every piece. It was part of a city art drive last month. People drop off work, and we sort it as best we can." Lila sighed, glancing through a stack of donation forms, hoping for a clue. But the trail was cold. She tried local galleries next, beginning with the ones her family's name supported. The curators there were polite but dismissive, clearly uninterested in an unsigned piece from an unknown artist. By the time she reached the smaller, grittier studios on the east side, her frustration had turned to determination. These spaces smelled of turpentine and desperation, their walls alive with works that defied convention. In a dimly lit corner of one such gallery, a young man with paint-streaked hands glanced up from his easel as she approached. "You're looking for what?" he asked, his tone wary. Lila showed him a photo of the painting. His eyes flicked to it briefly, then back to her, his brow furrowing. "Never seen it before," he said, but his voice wavered. "You're lying," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. He straightened, his jaw tightening. "Look, artists talk. There's a guy maybe who used to paint like that, but he's not around anymore." "Not around where?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "East Side, near 14th and Market. But don't expect much. Well, let's just say he's not painting for galleries anymore." Lila's pulse quickened. "What's his name?" The man shrugged. "Never gave it. Just shows up sometimes, sells sketches on the street." Summerth. That evening, Lila found herself on 14th Street, her heels clicking against the pavement as she scanned the bustling chaos. The hum of traffic, the distant wail of a saxophone, and the faint chatter of late-night vendors filled the air. Then she saw him. He sat on a bench beneath a flickering street lamp, sketching in a worn notebook. His clothes were frayed, his boots caked with grime, but his posture was straight, his focus sharp. Lila approached cautiously, her heart pounding. "It's you, isn't it?" The man didn't look up. "Depends. Who's asking?" "I'm Lila Montgomery," she said. "I bought your painting." That made him pause. Slowly, he closed his notebook and raised his gaze. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, but shadowed with something darker. "I didn't sell it," he said flatly. "You donated it." "No," he replied. "I abandoned it." The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. "Why?" she asked, her voice softer now. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Because it didn't matter. Not to me, not to anyone." "I don't believe that," she said. "It mattered to me." For the first time, his gaze softened, though skepticism lingered in his expression. "Then you're the only one." "I want to know why you made it," she pressed. "Why you gave it up." His jaw tightened and he stood, tucking the notebook under his arm. "Sometimes you have to let go of the things you love before they destroy you." He walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Lila stood under the sputtering street lamp, the words, "It mattered to me," echoing in her mind. She wasn't going to give up. Rain slicked the streets as Lila stepped out of her car, her umbrella struggling against the wind. She stood in front of the crumbling facade of the East Side Collective, the address she had traced from scattered conversations and a relentless internet search. The building looked abandoned, its faded sign hanging crookedly above the door. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it haphazard, some intricate, like forgotten masterpieces waiting to be rediscovered. Lila hesitated, her pulse quickening. The painting had brought her this far, and yet the uncertainty of what she might find here unnerved her. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The smell of damp wood and turpentine hit her immediately. Inside, the space was a chaotic graveyard of creativity. Broken easels, half-finished canvases, and brushes hardened with dried paint. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim, uneven light. She wandered through the space, her footsteps echoing on the cracked floorboards. The air felt heavy, charged with the ghosts of ambition and despair. Near the back of the room, she stopped. Leaning against the wall, partially hidden by a torn tarp, was a small painting. It depicted a man hunched under a street lamp, his features obscured but his posture heavy with exhaustion. The style was unmistakable, raw, evocative, and deeply personal. Her breath caught as she leaned closer. The signature in the corner was faint but undeniable: Ethan Wells. The name stayed with her as she walked back to her car, her heels clicking on the rain-slicked pavement. Ethan Wells. It wasn't just a name, it was a puzzle piece, a hint at the life behind the art. Once home, she dove into research. The name brought up only fragments, a few mentions of exhibits from years ago, an article in an obscure art blog praising his hauntingly intimate style. Then, the trail abruptly ended. It wasn't just anonymity. It was absence. She stared at the glowing screen of her laptop, frustration bubbling under her skin. How could someone with such a distinct voice in their work simply vanish? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, her assistant, Marcy, handed her a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "This just came for you," Marcy said, eyeing it curiously. Lila tore open the wrapping, revealing a single sheet of paper inside. It was a sketch of her, seated at the auction, her face captured in a mix of curiosity and quiet determination. Beneath the drawing were the words, "Some mysteries don't want solving. Let it be." Her heart raced. He had been watching her. She stared at the sketch, her fingers trembling. Ethan Wells wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was here, in her world, and he had left her a message. But if he thought she would give up, he didn't know her at all. If you are enjoying the story, help us by subscribing to the channel. And please leave a comment to let us know what you're thinking about the story. This is of huge importance to us. She returned to 14th Street. The city bustled around her, its sounds and lights a chaotic symphony. Her heart pounded as she approached the familiar bench beneath the flickering street lamp. He was there. Ethan sat hunched over his sketchbook, his pencil moving rapidly across the page. He didn't look up as she approached, but she noticed the way his shoulders tensed, as if he knew she was coming. "You're persistent," he said without looking up. "And you're elusive," she replied, sitting beside him. He smirked faintly, but kept sketching. "Why are you here, Lila?" "Because your work deserves to be seen," she said. "And because I think you have more to say than you let on." Ethan finally stopped sketching and turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What do you want from me?" "I want to know why you walked away," she said. He exhaled, leaning back on the bench. "Maybe I didn't walk away. Maybe I was pushed." "By who?" He shrugged. "By the system, by life, by people who say they care but only want to take." "That's not me," she said firmly. He studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching hers. Then he stood, tucking his sketchbook under his arm. "Maybe you believe that," he said. "But belief doesn't change reality." As he walked away, disappearing into the city's shadows, Lila felt a familiar spark of determination ignite within her. She wasn't just curious anymore. She was invested. Ethan Wells had a story, and she was going to uncover it, no matter how many walls he put up. Lila had spent weeks trying to track Ethan down again. Every lead she followed ended in silence, as if he were a ghost, deliberately slipping through her grasp. Frustration simmered beneath her polished exterior, spilling over into her conversations with friends and colleagues. "You've been distracted lately," Daphne remarked over lunch, her voice tinged with concern. "Is this about that painting?" "It's not just a painting," Lila said, her tone sharper than intended. "It's something more." Daphne raised an eyebrow. "More how?" Lila hesitated. How could she explain it? That Ethan's art, and now Ethan himself, had sparked a restlessness she couldn't ignore? That she wasn't just chasing a mystery, but something she didn't fully understand herself? "It just is," she said finally, stirring her iced tea. Daphne sighed, clearly unconvinced, but let the matter drop. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when she found him again. Lila had taken a detour through Union Square after a long meeting, hoping the bustling market might clear her head. Vendors lined the paths, their stalls brimming with handmade jewelry, fresh produce, and the occasional street performer. Then, through the crowd, she saw him. Ethan stood by a flower cart, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Bright yellow daisies mingled with lavender sprigs. His worn jacket and scuffed boots were out of place among the market's vibrant energy, but his presence was undeniable. Without thinking, she approached. "Ethan." He turned, his expression briefly startled before settling into something guarded. "Lila, what are you doing here?" "Looking for you," she admitted, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. Her gaze flicked to the flowers. "Didn't peg you as the floral type." He smirked faintly, glancing at the bouquet. "They're not for me." "Who are they for?" His smirk disappeared, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't name. "No one important." Lila tilted her head, sensing the lie but choosing not to press. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small sketch pad. "Here, for you." Ethan frowned. "What's this?" "A trade," she said. "You won't show me your art, so teach me how to make my own." He blinked, clearly taken aback. "You want me to teach you?" "Why not?" she asked, smiling. You've got time, don't you? And I'm not going to leave you alone anyway. For a moment, Ethan seemed torn. Then he sighed, taking the sketch pad. Fine, but don't expect me to go easy on you. One of their lessons began the next day. They met in parks and cafes, wherever Ethan felt most comfortable. At first, he was curt, his instructions terse, and his critiques unfiltered. Your lines are stiff, he said during their first session. It's my first time, Lila shot back, scowling. Doesn't mean it can't be better, he replied, smirking. But as the days turned into weeks, his edges softened. He would smile when she managed a decent sketch or tease her about her shading. Lila found herself looking forward to their lessons, not just for the art, but for the time spent with him. One evening, as they sat under a tree in Central Park, Ethan handed her a piece of charcoal. Try it, he said. She frowned. Isn't it messy? Art is messy, he replied. That's the point. She took the charcoal, hesitating before making her first mark. As she worked, Ethan leaned back against the tree, watching her. You're not afraid of getting things wrong, he said after a while. She glanced at him, surprised. What makes you say that? Because you keep trying, even when it's terrible, he said, a teasing smile playing at his lips. Lila laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. You should, he said, his tone softening. Most people give up before they even start. Later, as they packed up, Lila asked, Why do you keep creating, Ethan? Even when it's hard. He paused, his expression unreadable. Because it's the only thing that makes sense. Even when everything else doesn't. She nodded, understanding more than she let on. Then don't stop. Ethan met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Maybe, he said quietly. That night, as Lila walked home, she felt the weight of their conversation settle in her chest. Ethan's vulnerability, his quiet strength, it all drew her in, piece by piece. For the first time, she realized it wasn't just his art that captivated her. It was him. Ethan's name had become a mantra in Lila's mind, a puzzle piece that refused to fit until she had the whole picture. Over the weeks, she pieced together fragments of his past, an artist once on the verge of stardom, praised for his raw emotional depth, only to vanish without explanation. That morning, she woke with a new resolve. She texted Ethan, Meet me at the gallery, there's something I want to show you. He didn't reply, but she wasn't deterred. She had learned by now that Ethan often operated on his own time, his own terms. Hours later, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Ethan arrived at the small gallery space she had rented. He lingered at the entrance, his posture stiff, as if bracing for bad news. Come in, Lila said, her voice warm as she waved him inside. The gallery was quiet, the walls adorned with pieces she had pulled from his old studio. She had cleaned and framed them, each one telling a fragment of Ethan's story. He froze as his eyes scanned the room. What is this? This, she said, stepping closer, is what I found in your studio. These pieces deserve to be seen, Ethan. They're incredible. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. You had no right to take these. I didn't take them, she said softly. I rescued them. They were gathering dust in a space no one visits. I wanted to remind you of what you've created, of what you're capable of. Ethan turned away, his breath coming in short bursts. You don't get it, Lila. These pieces, they're not just paintings. They're pieces of me, and they're broken, just like I am. Her heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his voice. Ethan, she said, moving to stand beside him. Maybe they are broken, but that doesn't mean they're worthless. Sometimes the broken pieces tell the most powerful stories. He didn't reply, but she saw the way his shoulders sagged, the fight leaving him. After a long silence, he finally said, Do you know what happened? Why I stopped? Lila shook her head. No, but I want to. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I was good. At least people told me I was. I had shows, attention, praise, but it wasn't enough. My manager wanted more pieces, more commissions. I started painting for them, not for me. It was exhausting, draining. Then one day, I found out he'd been selling some of my work under his name. Said he was doing me a favor, keeping the market hot. Lila's stomach churned. That's awful. It was, he said bitterly. And when I confronted him, he told me I wasn't indispensable, that the world didn't need another tortured artist. So I walked away, burned every bridge I had. Lila's voice was soft but firm. You didn't burn those bridges, Ethan. They were built on lies. And the people who lied to you, they don't get to decide your worth. He turned to her, his eyes filled with something fragile and unspoken. It's not just them, Lila. It's me. I stopped believing in myself a long time ago. Her chest tightened, but she held his gaze. Then let me believe in you. Let me remind you why you started in the first place. That evening, Lila took him back to her apartment. She led him to the painting, the first one she'd ever seen of his. "Do you remember this?" she asked. He nodded, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame. "It was one of the last pieces I finished before everything fell apart. It was the first piece I bought that actually made me feel something," she said. "It's what started all of this." Ethan's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Guess I owe you a thank you for overpaying." She laughed, the sound lightening the room. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan, except maybe another painting." He raised an eyebrow. "Another painting?" "Yeah," she said, her voice teasing. "Something new, something for the future." Ethan stared at her for a long moment before nodding. "All right, but if it's terrible, you're not allowed to tell me." "Deal," she said, grinning. That night, as Lila sat on her couch, Ethan working quietly beside her with a fresh canvas, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. It wasn't just the art that mattered. It was him. The gallery space felt alive now, even in its emptiness. Ethan had taken over the back room, transforming it into a working studio. Canvases leaned against the walls, some finished, others only beginnings. Bursts of color and emotion that spoke louder than words ever could. Lila stepped inside, carrying a bag of takeout and a bottle of wine. "Dinner delivery," she announced, setting the bag on a nearby table. Ethan glanced up from the canvas he was working on, a smudge of paint streaking his cheek. "Do you ever stop hovering? Do you ever stop working?" she countered, pulling out 2 containers of noodles. He smirked but didn't argue, wiping his hands on a rag before joining her at the table. They ate in companionable silence, the faint hum of the city filtering through the open windows. "I've been thinking," Lila said, twirling a strand of noodles around her fork. "That's dangerous," Ethan teased. She rolled her eyes but smiled. "I'm serious. Your work deserves to be seen. We should do a show." Ethan froze, his fork hovering midair. "No." "Why not?" He set his fork down, his expression darkening. "Because I'm not ready, and I don't want to turn this into what it was before. A spectacle, a product. This wouldn't be that," she said gently. "It wouldn't be about sales or critics. It would be about connection, about sharing your story." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "What if people don't get it? What if they don't care?" "They will," Lila said firmly, "because your art is honest, and that's what people need." He didn't respond, but she saw the way his hands tightened, as if holding on to something unseen. Over the following weeks, Lila worked quietly to create the foundation for the show. She curated the space, carefully selecting pieces that told Ethan's story, not just of loss, but of resilience. Ethan remained hesitant, but as the gallery filled with his work, something shifted. He started spending more time there, lingering after his sessions, watching as Lila arranged the space with meticulous care. One evening, as she adjusted the lighting on a particularly striking canvas, Ethan spoke from behind her. "Why are you doing this, Lila?" She turned, meeting his gaze. "Because I believe in you, and because the world needs to see what I see." His expression softened, and for a moment, he looked like he might argue, but instead, he nodded. "All right, let's do it. But on one condition." "Name it." "No price tags," he said. "No critics, just the art." "Deal," she said, smiling. The night of the private showing, the gallery hummed with quiet anticipation. Lila had kept the guest list small. Local artists, a few patrons who appreciated authenticity, and friends who had supported Ethan through the years. Ethan stood in the corner, his posture tense but his expression calm. He wore a dark button-up shirt and jeans, a compromise between his usual casual attire and the event's understated elegance. As people filtered in, their reactions were immediate. They lingered in front of his pieces, their expressions a mix of awe and reflection. Conversations buzzed softly, punctuated by words like raw, powerful, and honest. Ethan watched from his corner, his arms crossed, his eyes flickering with something close to disbelief. "They love it," Lila said, appearing beside him. He glanced at her, his voice low. "It's overwhelming." "Good overwhelming?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, good." One guest, a middle-aged woman in a simple dress, approached Ethan, her eyes red-rimmed. "This piece," she said, pointing to a painting of hands holding a cracked mirror. It feels like you're saying there's beauty in brokenness. Ethan stared at her, his throat tightening. That's exactly what I wanted to say. The woman smiled through her tears. Thank you. It's something I needed to see. As she walked away, Ethan turned to Lila, his expression unreadable. That's the first time someone's ever said that to me. And it won't be the last, she said, her voice warm. By the end of the night, Ethan was visibly exhausted but lighter, as if a weight he had carried for years had finally lifted. As they locked up, he turned to Lila. Thank you. For what? She asked, smiling. For not giving up on me, he said. She shook her head. We don't give up on the things that matter. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, the unspoken connection stronger than ever. Come on, she said, breaking the silence. I'll buy you a late-night coffee. We've got work to do tomorrow. Ethan laughed softly. Work? You sound like me now. Maybe you're rubbing off on me, she teased, leading him out into the night. The gallery was unrecognizable, transformed into a space of quiet elegance. Soft lighting illuminated the walls, highlighting Ethan's pieces, each one carefully curated by Lila to tell a cohesive story. The buzz of conversation filled the room as guests filtered in, their expressions ranging from curiosity to awe. Ethan stood near the back, a glass of water in hand. He wore a dark blazer Lila had insisted on, paired with his usual jeans and worn boots, a reluctant compromise between his world and hers. His posture was tense, his gaze darting from painting to painting, as if seeing them through the eyes of strangers for the first time. You're doing great, Lila said as she joined him, her voice low and soothing. He huffed a soft laugh. I'm standing in the corner avoiding eye contact. That's great. It's a start, she teased. Ethan's lips quirked into a faint smile, but his tension didn't ease. I don't know if I can do this, Lila. You can, she said firmly. This is your moment, Ethan. Own it. The evening unfolded smoothly, at first. Guests lingered in front of Ethan's pieces, their comments glowing. A few approached him, offering kind words that seemed to catch him off guard. Then came Edward Montgomery. Lila spotted her father the moment he entered, his sharp suit and commanding presence cutting through the crowd. He greeted a few familiar faces before making his way toward Ethan, his expression unreadable. Mr. Wells, Edward said, extending a hand. Congratulations. It seems you've managed to make quite an impression. Ethan hesitated before shaking his hand. Thank you. Edward's gaze flicked to one of the nearby paintings, his lips curling faintly. Your work is unorthodox, raw. I can see why Lila is drawn to it. Ethan's jaw tightened. Unorthodox isn't always a bad thing. True, Edward replied. But in the art world, polish matters. Presentation matters. People want something that reflects their success, not their struggles. Lila stepped forward, her voice sharp. Dad. Edward glanced at her, a faint smirk on his lips. I'm just offering some advice, sweetheart. I want to make sure Mr. Wells understands the market he's entering. The market doesn't matter, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. What matters is the story, and if people don't get it, that's their loss. Edward chuckled, the sound low and dismissive. Perhaps, but stories don't pay the bills. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan's expression darkened and he stepped closer. Maybe they don't, but they remind people why they bother to keep living. And that's worth more than any paycheck. Edward's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of something more serious. Before he could respond, Ethan set his glass down and walked out of the gallery, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Lila found him outside, pacing on the sidewalk. The crisp night air bit at her cheeks as she approached him. Ethan, she called softly. He stopped, his shoulders stiff. I knew this was a mistake. No, it wasn't, she said, stepping closer. You stood your ground. You showed them who you are. And what good did it do? He snapped, his voice raw. Your father's right. I'm not polished. I'm not marketable. I don't belong in there. Her heart ached at the pain in his voice. Ethan, that's not true. Your work matters because it's real, because it's you. He shook his head, turning away. This isn't my world, Lila, and I can't keep pretending it is. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Ethan, please. Don't let one man's opinion make you forget why you started this in the first place. He turned back to her, his eyes blazing. It's not just him. It's everyone. People don't want honesty, Lila. They want something safe, something easy. I'm not that, and I never will be. Before she could respond, he walked away, disappearing into the night. Back inside, Lila found her father standing by one of Ethan's paintings, his expression contemplative. "Why do you always do this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Edward turned, raising an eyebrow. "Do what?" "Tear people down just because they don't fit into your perfect little world," she said. "Ethan's work is incredible, and all you can see is what it's not." Her father sighed, his tone softening. "Lila, the world isn't kind to dreamers. I've learned that the hard way. I don't want you investing in something that won't last." "It's not about me," she said fiercely. "It's about him. And whether you get it or not, he's going to last because he has something you never will. Heart." Edward looked taken aback, but Lila didn't wait for his response. She left the gallery, determination burning in her chest. She wasn't giving up on Ethan. Not now. Not ever. The rain started as a drizzle, dampening the city streets. But by the time Lila found herself wandering East 14th, it was a full storm. Water pooled at her feet, soaking her shoes, but she didn't care. She needed to find him. Ethan had disappeared after the gala, slipping into the city's shadows like a ghost. She had searched for him at the usual places, the bench under the flickering street lamp, the park where he often sketched, but he was nowhere. The storm mirrored the ache in her chest. It wasn't just about his art anymore. It was about him. After hours of searching, she finally spotted him. Ethan was sitting on the steps of an old church, his shoulders hunched, his hair plastered to his face by the rain. His sketchbook lay forgotten on his lap, the pages warped and damp. "Ethan," she called softly, stepping closer. He didn't look up. "Go home, Lila." "No." She sat beside him, ignoring the cold seeping through her coat. "Not until you talk to me." "There's nothing to say," he said, his voice flat. "Yes, there is," she insisted. "You walked out last night and you've been running ever since. Tell me why." Ethan laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You know why. I don't belong in that world, Lila. Your father was right. I'll never be enough for people like him." Her chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "You're not doing this for my father, Ethan. You're doing it for you, for the people who see your work and feel something real." He turned to her then, his eyes dark and filled with pain. "And what happens when they stop caring? When the next shiny thing comes along and I'm forgotten all over again?" Lila's throat tightened. "Is that what you think will happen?" "I know it will," he said bitterly. "Because that's how it works, Lila. People take what they want and leave you empty." She reached out, placing a hand over his. "Not everyone. Not me." Ethan looked down at their hands, his expression wavering. "Why, Lila? Why do you care so much?" "Because I see you," she said, her voice trembling. "Not just your art, but you, and you're worth fighting for." For a long moment, he said nothing, the rain falling around them in a steady rhythm. "I'm scared," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of trying again. Of failing again." Lila's grip on his hand tightened. "Then let me be scared with you. We can face it together." The rain eased as the night wore on, and they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was quieter, steadier. "I don't know if I can do this, Lila, but I want to try." Relief flooded through her and she smiled. "That's all I need to hear." Over the next few days, Ethan returned to the gallery. He worked quietly, pouring himself into new pieces. But something had shifted. He was more open now, allowing Lila to sit with him as he sketched, asking her opinion on colors and themes. Their connection deepened in the quiet moments, over shared meals, late-night conversations, and the unspoken understanding that grew between them. One evening, as they cleaned up after a long day, Ethan spoke. "I think I'm ready." "For what?" Lila asked, glancing at him. "A show," he said, his tone firm. "But something small, for the people who actually care." Her smile lit up the room. "I can make that happen." The private showing was set for the following month, and Lila poured herself into the preparations. She kept the guest list intimate, inviting local artists, collectors who valued authenticity, and people who had supported Ethan through the years. When the night finally arrived, Ethan stood in the center of the gallery, his shoulders squared and his expression calm. The room was filled with quiet admiration, the attendees engaging deeply with his work. Ethan caught Lila's eye across the room, and she smiled, her heart full. He was finally stepping into the light. The gallery hummed with quiet energy. The walls, adorned with Ethan's pieces, seemed to vibrate with the raw emotion they conveyed. Unlike the grand gala weeks ago, this private showing felt personal, intimate. Every attendee was here because they cared, not for status or spectacle, but for the connection Ethan's art offered. Ethan stood near the entrance, his hands shoved into the pockets of his dark jeans. He wore a simple button-up shirt, and though his posture was casual, there was a calm determination in his eyes. This time, he wasn't hiding in the shadows. "Ready?" Lila asked, stepping beside him. He glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not even close." She laughed softly. "That's the perfect place to start." As guests began filtering in, the room filled with murmured admiration. People lingered in front of Ethan's work, their faces reflecting the impact of his raw, unpolished style. A young artist approached Ethan, his eyes wide with awe. "I've never seen anything like this. It's like you're telling a story without words." "That's the goal," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the hint of nerves in his posture. "What's the story behind this one?" the artist asked, gesturing to a painting of hands cradling a flickering flame. Ethan hesitated, his gaze softening as he looked at the piece. "It's about holding on to hope, even when it feels like it's slipping away." The artist nodded, clearly moved. "Thank you for sharing this. It's incredible." As the young man walked away, Ethan exhaled, turning to Lila. "That wasn't terrible." "No, it wasn't," she said, smiling. "You're doing great." The evening unfolded with more moments like that. Genuine connections, heartfelt conversations. Guests approached Ethan not as a distant artist, but as someone whose work had touched them personally. Toward the end of the night, a middle-aged woman approached him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "This one," she said, pointing to the painting of the cracked mirror. "It feels like you're saying that it's okay to be broken, that there's still beauty in the pieces." Ethan's throat tightened. "That's exactly what I wanted to say." The woman smiled through her tears. "Thank you. I've been trying to find the words for what I've been feeling. And this says it all." As she walked away, Ethan turned to Lila, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never had someone tell me that before. And it won't be the last time," she said softly. As the last of the guests trickled out, Ethan and Lila sat on the gallery floor, surrounded by the remnants of the night. "You did it," she said, handing him a glass of wine. He took it, swirling the liquid before taking a sip. "We did it." Lila raised her glass in a toast. "To the future." Ethan clinked his glass against hers, a rare, genuine smile spreading across his face. "To whatever comes next." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the evening settling over them. Then Ethan glanced at the painting of the flickering flame. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I didn't think I'd ever feel like this again." "Like what?" Lila asked, tilting her head. "Like I'm part of something bigger," he said. "Like I matter." "You've always mattered, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "You just needed to see it." He looked at her then, his expression softening. "And you showed me." Their gazes held, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. The city buzzed with its usual energy, but inside the East Side Collective, time seemed to stand still. Ethan's show had ended weeks ago, but its echoes lingered. His work had left an indelible mark on everyone who saw it, sparking conversations about resilience, authenticity, and the beauty of imperfection. The gallery itself had transformed. What had started as a private project for Ethan had become a haven for underprivileged artists, a space where talent was nurtured and stories were celebrated. It was Lila's brainchild, a vision she had turned into reality with Ethan's unwavering support. Lila stood on the gallery balcony, overlooking the city skyline. The evening air was cool, carrying with it the faint hum of life below. A glass of wine rested in her hand, but her gaze was distant, lost in thought. Behind her, Ethan emerged from the gallery, his steps quiet. "There you are," he said, leaning against the railing beside her. "Just taking it all in," she replied, smiling softly. He glanced inside where a group of young artists worked on their pieces. "You did this, you know." "We did this," she corrected. Ethan shook his head. "No, Lila. This was you. You turned this place into something real, something meaningful." She looked at him, her heart full. "And you reminded me what real looks like." Inside, a crowd had gathered to see Ethan's latest work, a painting he had kept hidden even from Lila. It hung in the center of the room, unveiled only moments ago. Lila stood before it now, her breath catching as she took it in. The painting was of her, standing in a field of wildflowers, her face tilted toward the sunlight. The edges of the canvas were dark, shadowed, but the light surrounding her was vibrant, almost alive. It was a portrait, but it was also a story, a testament to everything they had built together. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "It's you," he said simply. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "No, Ethan, it's us." Chakawais. As the event wound down, Ethan and Lila found themselves alone in the gallery, the soft hum of the city their only companion. "What's next for you?" Lila asked, leaning against one of the pedestals. Ethan smiled faintly. "The same thing as always. Creating, living. And for us?" she asked, her voice quiet. He stepped closer, taking her hand in his. "For us? Whatever we want." She laughed softly, her chest tightening with a mix of joy and hope. "That sounds perfect." The night ended with them walking through the city, hand in hand. The world around them was alive with noise and light, but they were in their own quiet bubble, a place where everything felt possible. Ethan glanced at Lila, his expression soft. "You know, for the longest time, I thought my art was all I had, that it was the only part of me that mattered. And now?" she asked, her voice warm. "Now I know it's more than that," he said. "It's about who I share it with." Lila smiled, squeezing his hand. "Then let's keep sharing it. Together." As they disappeared into the city's rhythm, the future stretched before them, vibrant and full of promise. The East Side Collective buzzed with quiet activity. Young artists moved through the space, their faces alight with determination and creativity. Brushes scraped against canvas, pencils danced over sketch pads, and the air was filled with the unmistakable energy of something new being born. Lila watched from the corner, her heart swelling as she took it all in. This was her favorite time of day, when the studio was alive with possibility, each artist finding their voice in ways that felt both personal and universal. Daydreaming again? She turned to find Ethan standing behind her, a faint smirk on his face. His hands were streaked with paint, and there was a relaxed ease in his posture that hadn't been there a year ago. "Not daydreaming," she said, smiling. "Just appreciating." He stepped closer, following her gaze. "It's something, isn't it?" "It's everything," she replied softly. The gallery had grown in ways neither of them had expected. What began as a space for Ethan's redemption had become a sanctuary for others like him, artists who had been overlooked, dismissed, or simply forgotten. Through the collective, Lila had found her purpose, a way to use her family's resources for something that mattered. And Ethan, through his mentorship and guidance, had rediscovered the joy of creation, not as an obligation, but as a gift. Later that evening, as the last of the artists packed up and headed home, Lila and Ethan lingered in the quiet studio. Ethan stood before one of his newest works, a bold, abstract piece full of movement and color. "What do you think?" he asked, glancing at her. She tilted her head, studying the painting. "I think it's you. Unapologetic. Honest." He chuckled. "That's high praise." "It's the truth," she said, stepping closer. Ethan turned to her, his expression softening. "You know, I didn't think I'd ever get here. To this place. To this life." She smiled, her eyes warm. "You earned it. Every step of the way." He reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "And I couldn't have done it without you." Lila leaned into his touch, her voice quiet but steady. "We did it together, and we're just getting started." Hurry. As they locked up the studio and stepped out into the cool night, the city stretched before them, alive with light and possibility. Ethan took her hand, their fingers intertwining effortlessly. "So," he said, glancing at her with a teasing smile, "what's next on the agenda, Ms. Montgomery?" Lila laughed softly, the sound full of hope. "Whatever we want, Mr. Wells. Whatever we want." And as they walked into the night, their hearts full and their futures bright, they knew they had found something rare and unshakable, a love built not on perfection, but on the beauty of shared purpose and unwavering belief in one another. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. This billionaire offered a struggling waitress a deal she couldn't refuse. Marry him for 1 year in exchange for freedom from her crushing debt. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. From explosive secrets to high-stakes betrayal, their contract spirals into an emotional battleground.